Well, hello everyone. I'm John Peelan. I'm Director of the Scottish Council on Archives and delighted to welcome you to the latest in our series of lunchtime webinars on the theme of why records management matters. These events were originally planned to be part of a full-day conference, which we had to postpone because of COVID and lockdown, and we're now delighted to be offering them as weekly events, which have been very, very popular. The conference itself was going to be the third in a series of conferences that SCA has been running since 2018 on the broad theme of why archives and records management matters. Today we're delighted to welcome Professor Ian Levitt. Ian's going to talk and give a presentation, and at the end of that you'll have the opportunity to ask questions either by putting them in the chat box, or if you raise your hand then we can invite you to ask a question directly. Before we begin, can I ask you please just to make sure that your microphones are on mute and cameras can be on or off, entirely up to you. So without further ado, I'll now introduce Ian.
And good afternoon, everybody. If I could have, that's what my talk is about, accountability and redress. I think the subtitle of this group of talks was meant to be on accountability, truth and justice, but I can talk about accountability and redress from the perspective that I have gained. Can I have the next slide, please? In case you don't know anything about me, I've undertaken a number of research projects utilising source material, largely from records held at NRS and TNA, the National Archive at Kew. I've mainly concentrated on 19th and 20th century government policy, largely in relation to Scotland, but not entirely. For the last 3 years, I've been in a research consultancy with the Scottish Government in its response to the Scottish Abuse Inquiry, Child Abuse Inquiry request for information on government inspection systems in regard to children's institutions, and I've given evidence twice on the 1930 to 92 period, and I think that evidence is still on the inquiry's website. The presentation I'm about to give is drawn from records open to the public, so I'm afraid I've got no bottom drawer secrets to tell anybody. I mean, that's principally because the evidence I gave was based on records pretty much open to the public at the inquiry. Could I have the next slide, please? I define accountability really as a historian into public policy in regard to saying it's a review of past government decisions in public policy from archival research. Archival material is dependent largely on the retention policy that the various government documents and other public bodies have put in place in terms of the preservation of documents. In Scotland, I think the starting point, certainly for my research, would be the Public Registers and Records Scotland Act 1948, which enabled an agreement between the Scottish Office departments and the then Scottish Record Office on a retention schedule for documents. I can give a couple of examples to illustrate the extent of accountability for past decisions based on retention policy outside the area of child abuse, which I've been particularly concerned about for the last couple of years. Next slide, please. So I'm waiting for the next slide. All right, there we are. First, the retained papers on post-war housing programme in Scotland cover detailed discussions by the then relevant Scottish Office Department, Department of Health for Scotland, Scottish Office of Ministers, the Treasury and the UK Cabinet on funding. The papers that have been retained detail agreements with local authority on needs-based housing allocations. They also cover the decision that the primary focus for Newtown should be to link rehousing tenants in Glasgow's overcrowded slums with inward investment to attract new light industries, really to replace the old smokestack industries which everyone accepted were in decline. It was believed at the time in the 1950s and 60s and even into the 70s that it would bolster economic development in Scotland. That's the first example. The second example, please, for the next slide. Second example drawn from what that I've had published is that the legislation attached to the new National Health Service in 1948 enabled grant aid for a hospital building programme. It would assist a hospital building programme, it was accepted, would assist the UK's medical schools. Scotland at the time had 4 medical schools, Aberdeen, St Andrews, with a hospital based at Dundee, Glasgow and Edinburgh. There was an agreement between the 4 that a new hospital at Dundee should take precedent in Scotland, even ahead of Edinburgh's Royal Infirmary, which was reckoned at the time to require refurbishment. Can I have the next slide? The aim for the Scottish medical schools and the Department of Health of Scotland was to beat both London and Cardiff to the post. I think London was a preference from the English Ministry of Health and Cardiff from the then Welsh medical lobby. The archival papers illustrate the machinations, and I have to say there are a lot of machinations involved in both Scotland and the relevant UK committees, including the Cabinet, to secure 9 wells. Informed opinion in Scotland believed that without that investment, the number of Scottish medical schools would drop to 3 because the advance of medical science required upgraded facilities. Can I have the next slide, please? Both of these examples indicate the detail of official discussion and ministerial instruction after representation from external organisations, which obviously included local authorities, business leaders, medical bodies and universities. One could give other examples. For instance, in the area of childcare, the retained papers cover official and ministerial discussion which led to the Children Act 1948 and the Social Work Scotland Act 1968. And in fact, more than 5,000 files alone have been retained on the 1968 Act. In fact, I lost count once I got through the first couple of pages. The latter Act, 68 Act, emphasised prioritising provision for children within the community under a programme of social education instead of the use of institutional care, certainly for older children at the time. Could I have the next slide, please? So you can account, the papers that have been retained can account for high policy in the post-war era. Ministers took decision on prospective legislation and such were implemented, but not necessarily the same as notions of redress, certainly for individuals affected by public policy. It's not for me to discuss the work of the inquiry, but I can review the national records available on children's institutions and on childcare generally. Next slide, please. It's important to start from the impact and the effect of the Public Register and Records Scotland Act 1948. The consequent destruction order that was issued after the Act had been passed led to the pulping of much of the pre-war 1945 health and welfare records, as well as those in other areas of public policy, much to the loss of many historians. Papers which don't survive in the area of childcare include inspection reports of children's homes, foster care and approved schools, which date from the mid-19th century. In fact, I think they started in 1850. There are some summary reports of these inspections surviving in the various command papers of that particular period. A very small number of inspection reports on children's homes, 1934 to 45, have been retained, and there's one partial report of an approved school, St Joseph's Tranent, and that was really dealing with sanitary accommodation. It was a report by an inspector to say that sanitary accommodation had improved over the last couple of years of his inspection. Could I have another Next slide, please. And for record retention after 1948. Well, between 1934 and 1960, under the then childcare legislation, the Scottish Home Department, that was the Scottish Office Department that, whose brief covered childcare, kept a record, a card of every child boarded out by a local authority. It included whether the child was with foster parents or in a children's home. The latter required, a children's home required to be registered with the government under statute, the 1933 Children and Young Persons Act. There was a belief that periodic visits by the Scottish Home Department's childcare inspectors would ensure local authorities were attentive to their duties, and there are examples cited in the minutes on the quality of care provided or not. It's not, the examples in the minutes are not very extensive, so one has to be very cautious about deriving any conclusions from that. The individual records, the cards, have long since gone. New regulations issued in 1959 on foster care and children's homes removed the Scottish Secretary's accountability for the placement of a child. This was due principally because the local authority grant aid shifted from that being concerned with specific services to a general grant aid. And therefore Scottish officials and the Scottish ministers decided, as they were no longer responsible for accounting the specific childcare services grant, they had no responsibility therefore for keeping cards on every child boarded out by a local authority. Next slide, please. The same applied to children committed to an approved school. A central record was held on committal, transfer between schools and discharge. The records were necessary because they related to the general supervisory duties under statute and again the distribution of the approved school grant aid. Central government, that is the Scottish Office, assisted in the allocation of pupils to schools. As one official put it in 1 minute, they were essentially a bed bureau, i.e. they ensured that an approved school child was sent in their minds to the correct school given age and gender. Again, the records have not been retained. In 1979, List D schools were advised by the Social Work Services Group, the Scottish Office sub-department that ran childcare after the 1968 Act, that they should be destroyed after a period of 12 years from the date of committal, and that all pre-1959 58 records should similarly be destroyed. A central register was kept on corporal punishment. It was a requirement of the regulations, and a few redacted examples from the 1970s survive. The next slide, please. What of central inspection? Inspection of children's homes, local authority and voluntary, continued until 1973, when the Social Work Services Group decided that under the Social Work Scotland Act 1968, as the homes were registered by local authorities, it was not the function of central government to engage in inspection. Local authorities were therefore left to devise their own inspectorial templates, though I've not come across any such templates that were deposited with the National Records of Scotland in the retained files. List D schools, the previous approved schools, continued to be inspected until abolition in the 1980s. Detailed reports on children's homes before 1973 survive, and also List D schools before abolition, but it is not, the retained records do not provide a comprehensive list of every home or school that were inspected. Indeed, you can have some homes where there's a series of years where the inspection reports have been retained and then there's a gap, or they're not retained thereafter, And the same with approved schools. The retained records can be seen, and then there's a gap, and then they're seen again. So it is not a consistent, comprehensive report of every school or every home during that particular period. Can I have the next slide, please? If I'm given an example of inspections, or three examples, it'll provide some idea of the nature of the inspection system and the results of the inspection system. Wellington Approved School, which is located, I think, just south of Dalkeith, was obviously subject to regular inspections by the HM Inspector of Schools. In 1959, during one inspection, the HM Inspector of Schools entered a dispute with the managers of the school, particularly the headmaster and the chairman of the Board of Governors, because he wished to talk to pupils alone without any member of staff, in particular the headmaster, being present. The HM Inspector of Schools was concerned that the school was engaged in an alleged breach of approved school discipline regulations, and the discipline regulations form part of the statute then governing approved schools. After considerable discussion, which I think went on for about a year, the Scottish Secretary decided that in the pupil's interest, the Inspector of Schools could talk to a pupil without a member of staff being present. And after the incident, the retained files reveal the HM Inspector of Schools did talk without a member of staff being present, and such did reveal infraction of disciplinary regulations, if not abuse. If one looks across the retained files on approved schools, the inspections cover training, education provision, sanitary accommodation, diet, and discipline and record keeping. So there are quite extensive reports of the schools during the period. Can I have the next slide, please? In 1961, following a well-publicised allegation on the standard of care at a West Lothian children's home, the Scottish Secretary agreed an in-depth inquiry was required by the Scottish Office's Chief Childcare Inspector. The inquiry was assisted by a Scottish Office medical officer, and they concluded that the allegations were substantially correct. West Lothian removed the home's matrons, amongst other measures, to improve care, including clothing, sanitary accommodation, diet, discipline regime, to name but a few. Subsequent to the first inspection, the home was subject to a series of follow-up inspections, which were all designed to confirm that the improvements in care promised by West Lothian were actually in progress. Can I have the next slide, please? The third example in the 1970s, and another approved school, now a List D school at Gilsland in Ayrshire, a pupil was returned to the school after absconding. The pupil was left overnight in a corridor, handcuffed to a heating pipe on a mattress, with only the night supervisor to provide attention. The Social Work Services Group, after inspection and considerable correspondence, informed the headmaster that the policy was not only in contravention of the List D school regulations, but was liable to a charge of personal assault. Another school, Rossi, was also warned. Other schools may have been warned, but the papers have not been retained. Both Rossi and Gilsland were subsequently subject to close inspections, of which the papers do survive and have been retained. Could I have the next slide, please? So how can we review what I've just said? In the post-war period, at the level of policy formulation, the source material within the retained NRS papers, generally, including that on childcare, are of value. You can chart out the ministerial instructions on legislations and the issues that followed the legislation equally. Similarly, you can plot and chart out the way that civil servants implemented the instructions, and many of them across a range of issues are very illuminating in terms of the decisions taken. The files can also cover issues of day-to-day administration, the implementation of legislation and any attendant regulations. In Civil Service Code, the efficiency by which the legislation was implemented. In childcare, these include inspections by the childcare inspectors, Scottish Office Childcare Inspectors, the HM Inspector of Schools, the Scottish Office Medical Officers, as well as other official inquiry reports. Could I have the next slide, please? But the retained papers on care provided to individual children are sparse. They can be found, or rather individuals, children can be, are named, but they are redacted for public view in List D school punishment returns. They're also recorded in inspection reports and other inquiries on children's homes until 1973, and approved schools, List D schools, until abolition in 1980. Again, the copy available to the public have been redacted of these individual names. Similarly, there are also in inspection reports of local authority children's departments before 1970, where a child was fostered, again redacted. So there are substantial examples of inspection reports of children's homes, children's departments, List D school approved schools, which do or can provide information on children, but because they're redacted for public view. Next slide, please. Well, what are my conclusions? Certainly for the purposes that the Scottish Government, I think, require to provide information to the inquiry on, the retained records were reasonably sufficient to provide evidence on the inspection of children's homes and allied institutions, as well as on the general administration of childcare provision. One could certainly go from the mid-1930s right through to 92 and indicate what the system of inspection was, how regular it was, the depth of the inspection, and the consequences of ministerial and official action if the infraction of the regulations attached to the Acts of Parliament had been broken. But the research undertaken here illustrates some of the issues that surround archive retention policy, particularly the lack of information regarding individual children of the period, who are now called survivors. How far such records should be retained and in what format to assist redress is beyond consideration of this presentation. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you, Robert.
Okay, well, thank you. That was really interesting. And now I'd like to invite people in the audience to ask any questions of Ian. Maybe I can start off, Ian, by asking, were you surprised by the number of records that were post-war records that had been destroyed?
In the post-war period, for the kind of research I've traditionally undertaken, it really hasn't been an issue. You certainly found papers regarding ministerial instructions, used to be in blue buff paper at the time, have been retained. Certainly for any particular Act of Parliament that was being discussed, it's there. And certainly in the implementation of the legislation, again, the ministerial instructions have been retained. But once you get beyond that, it can vary considerably. I think from a historian's point of view, what you've got thereafter is a series of examples of policy being implemented, rather than every nook and cranny of every policy being retained. So one can one can conclude there was a system of inspection of children's homes and approved schools, list D schools, but not every school record was retained.
About the comments you made on how information records about the care provided to individual children was sparse. Again, did that surprise you?
It did. I would have thought some examples would have been kept, even if they'd been redacted. For instance, I'm not absolutely certain what was on the card of a boarded out child before 1959. There are minutes which indicate the kind of information that was actually collected, but not precisely. And again, on the approved school list D card or form that was kept within St Andrew's House, I'm not absolutely sure what that card or form said. I've got a good idea, but I can't absolutely be certain.
And do you anticipate, as your work goes forward carrying out this research, that the detail within the records will be of more value to the inquiry going forward from the 1970s onwards?
I would have thought that, given that more records appear to have been retained post 1970, not necessarily in the depth that perhaps the inquiry would like, but nevertheless have been retained, that the inquiry themselves will see much more clearly, perhaps, how legislation was implemented and how, if you like, the general supervision of the 1968 and subsequent acts took place.
Okay, well, thank you, Ian. I can't see any questions coming from the audience. I'll give people one last chance if they want to raise their hand or make a point. And no, okay, well, in that case, Ian, thank you very much for your talk. That was really interesting, and really grateful for you taking the time to speak to us on our audience today. Thank you very much.
Okay, fine. If anybody else got any inquiries, they can contact me through your office if they like.
Absolutely. Okay. Right. Well, I'll ask you all to give a virtual round of applause to Ian. Thank you very much.
Thank you.